and good evening and a very warm welcome to my YouTube. The topic of this film is the de Havilland Vampire. Now, this was the first single-engine jet aircraft to exceed 500 miles an hour when it came into production. There isn't too much original black and white footage around, so what I've tried to do in this film is include some of the footage from the Vampires that are still flying around the world. Now, the film footage is mainly some from the UK and some of it is from Switzerland. I hope you'll agree the scenery of the flights in Switzerland is absolutely stunning. So, the usual old thing, make a cup of tea, plate of biscuits, comfy armchair, sit back and enjoy the film. See you in a bit. Cheers! The success of the Gloucester Meteor led to de Havilland Aircraft Company being approached to design and build an airframe for the Halford H1 turbojet engine, later to be called the DH Goblin. Initially designated DH99, it was called the Spider Crab. It was an all-metal design which was considered to be hugely experimental in its unorthodox arrangement of twin rear booms mounted behind a mould egg-shaped wood/aluminium fuselage and one single engine. The relative low power of the early jet engines had normally called for twin installations, but Major Frank Holford's new engine proved to be extremely efficient, making single-engine fighters a real possibility. In order to maximise the efficiency of this new technology and to respond to the Ministry's recommendations, the design was modified into a mixed wood and metal construction, which was redesignated as the DH100 Vampire. The prototype DH100 Vampire was first flown on the 20th of September 1943 at Hatfield by Geoffrey de Havilland, son of the founder. Some 6 months after the Meteor having been delayed by engine availability. The first production DH Vampire F1 was actually produced by English Electric Company at Warton due to production pressures and a lack of capacity at Hatfield. Despite finally arriving at the end of the Second World War, the DH Vampire was eagerly awaited and became the second British jet fighter to see service with the RAF. It was also given the honour of leading the VE Day flypast over London. The DH Vampire was the first RAF aircraft to be able to exceed 500 miles per hour, and its distinctive shape with twin tail boom and pod-like fuselage made it instantly recognisable in the air and from the ground. The main production version was to be the DH Vampire FB.52 fighter bomber, which was a modified DH Vampire 3, and this variant was also to be the basis of many of the export versions. Separate night fighter and trainer models were produced. A number of DH100 Vampires were also modified for shipboard use, such as the de Havilland DHC Vampire, and on the 3rd of December 1945, Captain Eric Winkle-Brown completed the first successful landing and takeoff of a jet fighter from the carrier HMS Ocean. It was also the Royal Navy's first jet fighter. The type was very successful in the export market too, providing many air forces with their first experience of a jet fighter, and around 30 air forces were ultimately to operate the type. Some 50 DH100 Vampires F1, F2 and FB variants were also purchased by the Royal Australian Air Force in 1946, and although the majority were built with Goblin engines, the second aircraft was actually built with a Rolls-Royce Nene power plant. An experimental version of the DH Vampire featured an extended wingspan and a DH Ghost engine, and it was the first aircraft that was to set a world altitude record of 59,446 feet in March 1948. Later that year, 6 de Havilland Vampire F3s became the first jet fighters to fly across the Atlantic for an RAF Goodwill tour of Canada. By the time production finally ended, 3,269 Vampires had been built in England and a further 1,067 built under licence abroad. The DH Vampire remained as a frontline fighter for the RAF until 1953, after which it was retained only in the pilot training and refresher role. Graham Innes very kindly sent me this dramatic footage that he filmed at Wolverhampton Halpenny Green when a Vampire WZ507 tore up the section of the runway, and it's very visible that the strength of the plane's exhaust propelled the surface of the runway into the air. As the plane turned alongside the runway, the damage intensified with debris from the runway surface hurtling upwards. The plane left a stream of debris in its wake as it picked up speed along the runway before launching above the crowds. It happened as hundreds of people turned out for the Halpenny Green Air Show. The video of the takeoff was very kindly sent to me, and Graham commented, it looks like runway 10 at Halpenny Green may be out of use for some time. Afterwards, the Vampire landed on another undamaged runway, and airfield staff were seen cleaning up the debris on the runway for some time. Elsewhere, the aircraft had surprisingly longevity, with large numbers still in service in several air forces in the 1980s. The Swiss Air Force was the last Vampire user, retiring their sizable fleet of DH Vampire FB.6s and T.55s from active service as late as 1990. The DH100 Vampire finally retired from RAF service in 1966, being replaced by the Hawker Hunter and the Gloucester Javelin. There are, as you can see, a large number of airworthy aircraft still flying today, predominantly due to its simple design and relatively easy maintenance. In addition, there are over 100 aircraft kept in superb condition at many display museums around the world. The Swiss Air Force operated 182 de Havilland DH100 Vampires. They were the early jet fighter bombers. The Vampire was the first jet fighter in the Swiss infantry, and they were initially used for air defence. The first four were F-1 fighter variants, purchased from the United Kingdom in 1946 to be used for evaluation and flight testing, and they remained in operation until 1961. Originally only 3 were purchased, but one crashed in 1946 and was replaced. They were powered by the de Havilland Goblin II turbojet engine. They are neat little jets, and the Swiss liked what they saw in the Vampire. In 1949, they bought 75 FB-6 fighter bombers, and they were transported by air from the UK, and they were delivered between 1949 and 1950. Most were retired by 1969, and a few were flying until 1973. A further 100 Vampire FB-6 fighter bombers were licensed built in Switzerland with the de Havilland Goblin III turbojet engine, and entered service between 1951 and 1952, plus 3 that were apparently built from spare parts in 1960. 3 DH115 T11 Vampire 2-seat trainers were purchased in 1951. 30 T55 2-seat trainers were license built and entered service between 1953 and 1959, and an additional 9 ex-RAF T11 trainers were purchased in 1967, and they were upgraded to the T55 standard. The trainers were powered by a de Havilland Goblin 35 turbojet engine. A single NF-10 night fighter was also supplied to the Swiss for evaluation and was flight tested from 1958 to 1961, but no further examples were purchased, and the type did not go into operational service. The little twin-boom jet was constructed as a combined metal and moulded plywood airframe, highlighting its DH-98 Mosquito design heritage. The fuselage was primarily plywood. The top speed of the Vampire was 548 miles an hour, and its armament consisted of 4 20mm Hispano nose-mounted cannons and up to 8 60-pound underwing rockets, or 2 500-pound bombs, or alternatively 2 drop tanks. As a fighter bomber, apart from cannons, it was relatively lightly armed, but this was the norm for most early jets in the 1940s. There is a beautifully restored example of a license-built Vampire FB6 fighter bomber on display in Hall 2 at the Swiss Air Force Centre near Zurich. The Vampire had limited instrumentation, no radar, and initially no ejection seat, and as we've heard, the armament comprised of 4 20mm guns in the nose. Now, Italy purchased the Vampire license in 1949 and paid by using highly devaluated British currency owned by the Bank of Italy. A total of 195 Vampire FB.52As were manufactured by Italian industry, including 89 from the Marchi assembly line in Varese. Together with 19 British-built aircraft, these Vampires served from 1949 to 1959 with the Naval Flying School, 3 fighter wings, and of various other Italian Air Force units. In 1952, 4 Vampires led by Lieutenant Chilotto formed within the 4th Stormo, the first official Italian post-war aerobatic team. In 1955, 56 Marchi sold to Egypt, 58 overhauled Vampires. The Vampire on display is marked to represent an aircraft based at Gate with the 15th Air Force Group of the 6th Stormer of the Italian Air Force, and is actually FB6 number 668, built by EFW in 1952 and used by the Swiss Air Force until 1990. Havilland Vampire was chosen to enter Italian Air Force service over the more expensive Gloucester Meteor, and during October 1949 an agreement was signed for the Vampire to be license-built by Fiat, who built 150 aircraft in total. During the aircraft's service life with the Italian Air Force, various variants were acquired ranging from trainers to night fighters. However, the most numerous version was the FB-52 fighter bomber. At their peak, the Italian Vampire fleet stood at 220 aircraft. In addition, the first post-war aerial display team of the Italian Air Force, called the Cavallino Rampante, also flew the Vampires. The footage coming up now is the Norwegian Historical Aircraft Squadron. They're based just south of Oslo, and they operate 2 de Havilland Vampire jets, which you'll see coming up in the footage. The Norwegian Historical Aircraft Squadron operate 2 de Havilland Vampire jets. One is the FB-52, which was marked as PX-K and registered LN-DHY, which was license-built in Switzerland in the year of 1952 as serial number 705. The aircraft was flown with the Swiss Air Force, marked as a Vampire J-1196 until 1990. A French owner flew it for a couple of years, until it was sold to Christer Anska in Sweden and registered SE-DXS. The aircraft was purchased from Sweden in May 2011 and is now operated by the Historic Squadron and based at Rygge Air Base near Oslo in southern Norway. The aircraft is now in the Royal Norwegian Air Force markings to represent Vampire PX-K, serving in the 336 Squadron in the early 1950s. This is Norway's first pure jet fighter squadron. And de Havilland Vampire that the squadron operate is a T.55, originally LN-DHZ, and it was licensed built in Switzerland by F&W Emmen in the year 1959 as serial number 990, and was also their last of 20 new Swiss-built 2-seaters. The aircraft was flown with the Swiss Air Force, marked as Vampire U-1230 until 1990. It was sold on auction in 1991 to Don Wood Source Classics flight at Bournemouth. The aircraft was purchased from Bournemouth, UK in 2005 and is now operated by the Flying Historical Squadron and based at Rygge Air Base near Oslo in southern Norway. The aircraft is now in the Royal Norwegian Air Force markings to represent Vampire PX-M, a 2-seater which served with 336 Squadron in the early 1950s, which also was Norway's first pure jet fighter squadron. RNAF2, the two-seater, spent time with 336 Squadron, 337 Squadron and 718 Squadron. No less than 804 two-seat T-11s were built for the RAF and for the Royal Navy, including well over 300 for export. Numerous others were built under licence in different countries. The Squadron have displayed at all the major air shows. They display extensively in Norway, and in the UK they've displayed at RAF Waddington, RAF Lucius, RAF Duxford, and also at the Royal International Air Tattoo at North Weald. Now, sometime later in 1959-1960, the Vampires were operating from what was, during the war, RAF Exeter, and the primary work for the Vampire at that time was in the training or retraining of radar operators using a fairly ancient radar equipment, so that expressions such as "you are entering my dark area, I can't see you" were fairly common, mainly carried out in what are termed practice interceptions, where one aircraft is vectored onto the other. There were other specific tasks with and without radar, one for instance to demonstrate the dropping of window foil strips used during World War II to confuse radar. The Vampires also worked with the Army gunnery ranges for ranging, etc., but although capable of towing a banner behind the dual Vampire T-11, it would be on a fairly short line, used in fact for air-to-air gunnery by other fighters, but in that regard the Mosquito had a long steel cable which gave a fair distance to the banner. And I do remember one time the story of a Mosquito pilot who, seeing the puffs getting a little close to his aircraft, said over the RT, "I'm pulling this bloody target, not pushing it." Here in the UK, the Vampire Preservation Group, which operate the WZ507, it's believed to be the only airworthy de Havilland Vampire T11 in the Northern Hemisphere, and they often ask if that can be confirmed or denied. They would really appreciate it. It's a non-profit making organisation dedicated to keeping this unique aircraft where it belongs, in the air. And if you wish to help keep WZ507 flying by either volunteering or donating some funds to them, they would welcome that, and the information and connections for that will be in the video description. I really hope you've enjoyed this brief look at the de Havilland Vampire. It was quite a unique little jet. It's interesting to see that there are still quite a few flying to this day. In any event, I'll wish you all the very best, take the greatest of care, and I look forward to seeing you on the next film. Oh, by the way, a new thing on my YouTube channel is Buy Me a Coffee, which helps just some small way, funds going to some small way to helping me produce some of the films. And of course, you're always very welcome to subscribe, no cost for that, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. All the very best. Cheers for now.